What you are looking at is a cave painting commonly called either the shaft scene or the well scene, discovered in the Lascaux caves in France in the 1940s. As you can see, it's quite a complicated display that attempts to exhibit a particularly unusual sequence of events. To start with the most apparent figure in the artwork, we can see a bison who has been disemboweled by what looks like a broken spear, presumably belonging to this man who lays beside it. I refrain from confirming that this man is injured or dying, which many suspect, as apart from laying down or having his mouth wide open, there doesn't seem to be any indicators as obvious as the bison's, but we will return to him shortly. Further down, we can see a bird calmly perched on a stick, and then to our left we can see a rhinoceros defecating and probably exiting the scene. Whatever the entirety of this image is trying to convey, whether that could be a memory of a hunting trip gone wrong, a religious fantasy, or maybe even someone's idea of a dark joke, there is a part of this painting that has intrigued researchers since it was first discovered. The man's penis is erect. Why? Well, maybe the answer lies perhaps in the location of this painting, which I'd argue is even more interesting than the painting itself. The Lascaux cave system is about 235 meters in length and 250 meters in depth, and contains 12 separate areas, 7 of which contain paintings. Our shaft scene is of course located in the shaft of the cave, which is especially fascinating because the shaft is located in the deepest and most obscure part of the system. So obscure in fact that when the caves were opened to visitors 70 years ago, many of them were completely unaware of its existence. Today it is only accessible using a 19-meter tall iron ladder carefully manned by researchers, meaning that whoever painted it approximately 20,000 years ago would have had to have descended down the shaft using a rope, work in very low lighting, and only for limited periods of time before the build-up of carbon dioxide would have made them lightheaded. I think it's sound to conclude that whoever painted this didn't really want other people to see it. This conclusion would suggest that the painting inspired shame in its artists. The artist was depicting something they thought would be condemned by an audience for crossing a boundary. Even if we were to spend this video analysing the painting until its most pedantic detail and constructed a solid and coherent narrative regarding the artist's intention, the obvious dichotomy of someone, perhaps a dead man pitching a tent next to a bloody scene of gruesome death, would still stick out, excuse the pun, and be the centre point of the analysis. This artist intertwined death and eroticism in a single image. Humanity's history regarding the relationship between death and sex is a complicated one. Michel Foucault tried his best to lay it out in his comprehensive study, The History of Sexuality, starting with how societies decided to manage life. This includes things like capital punishment and healthcare under much broader concepts like law, altruism and justice. When life becomes politicized and articulated, it forces both sex and death to share the same category of life operatives, a category that encompasses forces that have a direct effect on life. Sex, for all intents and purposes, creates life, whereas death is the cessation of it. They become linked in their relation to life. Foucault uses the example of ancient writers often viewing sexual activity as connected to bodily expenditure and decline. Sexual pleasure was not necessarily condemned, but it was seen as something requiring moderation because it consumed physical resources. Excessive sexual activity could weaken the body, disturb reason, and accelerate deterioration. Semen was frequently imagined as a concentrated form of life force, and ejaculation as a loss of strength. The paradox was that sexuality creates life while simultaneously depleting the living individual. What benefits the continuation of the species may weaken the person. This produces one of the deepest ancient links between sex and death. Sexuality is simultaneously generative and consumptive. It creates future generations while gradually exhausting the present one. Life reproduces itself through a process that also reminds humans of their bodily limits and eventual decline. Human beings are a unique animal in that we are aware of our own mortality. Unlike other animals, the human being knows it will die, which is understandably quite the psychological strain, and in an attempt to alleviate this fear, humans organise society in an attempt to negate it. In Ernest Becker's book, The Denial of Death, he states that this fear is the organising principle behind all of human behaviour, including religion, morality, politics, and, of course, sex. He argues that beneath all of these concepts and categories that we have created for ourselves is an attempt at immortality. Achievement, reputation, legacy, nation, family are all symbolic forms of permanence. The idea that after your death you will continue to exist symbolically beyond your death. Sex specifically achieves this through reproduction. Reproduction allows individuals to continue through their children and consequently help deny the knowledge of their death. However, I believe that this attempt at negating death is an incomplete explanation of the relationship between the two. In Plato's Symposium, Aristophanes offers the famous myth that humans were once whole beings that were divided in half by the gods, and that love and desire is that longing to recover a lost unity. Although this idea is rooted in myth, it was later picked up again by George Bataille in the 20th century, who expanded upon this idea of separateness. For Bataille, what differs humans from other animals is their isolation. A human being does not experience the world as one whole, with them included, but as a differentiated field that they are separated from and that they interact with. And as Becker said too, the human being is unfortunately aware of their eventual demise. However, Bataille doesn't immediately resign to denial as a product of this awareness, and in fact utilises and develops Freud's concept of the death drive. For Bataille, humanity is actually deeply haunted with longing to overcome this isolation, or as he calls it, continuity. He believes that people desire moments in which the boundaries separating us from everything else dissolve, and that we experience a sublime euphoria from these experiences, precisely because we, just for a moment, catch a glimpse of the fundamental unity of reality. If you would remember the man from the painting and take a closer look at him, you'll find he has the head of a bird, revealing a fundamental animistic layer to the artwork that was presumably achieved through the disillusionment of boundaries via both violence and eroticism. Death promises us the highest disillusion of boundaries, and therefore anything that can help symbolize or simulate death is sought after by humanity. Things that contradict things like utility, like roller coasters, drunkenness, horror films, violence, sports, art. All of these help dissolve our isolation for brief moments through the simulation of death. But eroticism holds a privileged position in this hierarchy because, as mentioned before, it is a life operative, holding just as much significance in civilization as death itself, thus being the highest form of death replication one can achieve. When I speak of sex here, I am referring more specifically to eroticism, the expression of sexual desire that transcends reproductive utility. Within the realm of eroticism, an individual's coherent sense of self, the same self that naturally seeks out control, stability and hierarchy, is broken down and the ego becomes destabilized, and at the height of orgasm, a brief but ecstatic moment of self-loss occurs. The individual is naked, both literally and symbolically. The disillusion of the boundaries that define an individual, all the I ams and am nots, are forgotten for a moment and forgotten without grief. For a moment, the individual is not an individual at all, but instead just unified continuity that only the cessation provided by death can achieve. Sex is a death simulation, a truth that our artist knew.